Hey, Angela, let's go. Go ahead. The one, what are you, right-handed or left-handed? I don't know if it makes any difference. Okay. Okay, go ahead. No, 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 that's fine. One. Hello, hello. Okay. Well, Hillary, I thank you so much for talking about accountability and looking at ourselves because, in a sense, that's what we're going to do right now. Are we going to have the voice come or not? No. Okay, later. All right. So we just had a panel about the state of the world. All right, and we thought about journalism, domestic, and sort of philanthropy in and of itself. And so right now we want to talk about specifically equity and social justice, and specifically race, okay? And I note that this is the only session that talks about race head on, okay? And to help us think about this topic, all right, which is fraught for many, many reasons and what philanthropy can do about it, I'm so pleased to have Angela Glover Blackwell. I won't read her bio to you per se, but just let me say that she is the founder and resident of PolicyLink, which is a well-known advocacy and research organization. She served 20 years as the president and CEO, and she's also a prominent American attorney, a civil rights advocate, and an author. So I am just so thrilled to have you here. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
So, like the previous panel, I want to talk to you about the big picture, but in the context of thinking about race, okay? You spoke eloquently about how our democratic norms and institutions, the way they are they're simply because they've been that way because that's the way we've always done it. There's that inertia aspect. And you've underscored that this moment right now, the last year, 2 years, or maybe 2022, presents a huge opportunity to challenges that have been long-standing and in the way of doing things. So I want to make sure that we do talk about that, how we got here and where we were. I think that's really important because we all have to have some basis of facts. But I need to ask you about one specific challenge in particular. We talked about this before. I've heard you speak. And you made a wonderful observation, which just kind of hit me right between the eyes. You said, black people are very comfortable about talking about racism. White people are very uncomfortable. Okay? I didn't ask you about Asian Americans, but I do want to know, elaborate on that for me. I think it's really important that we just sort of talk about it right now.
Thank you. Happy to be here. And that is an interesting question because after George Floyd was killed and the whole nation started talking about race in one way or another, so many people talked about how hard it was, how uncomfortable it was, and I just kind of joined that conversation about how hard it is. But one day I realized this really isn't hard for me. I have been talking about race my entire life. When I was 2 years old, crawling under the table while the adults were talking, that's all they were talking about. And then when I was able to join the table, I joined conversations about race. When I was with friends, when I was at church, when I was at school, black people talk about race. How could we not? Because it is constantly in our faces. And so it is often hard once white people decide to talk about race, to be able to enter the conversation understanding what novices white people are. Because they often haven't talked about it at all in any way, because it hasn't had to come up for them. And when you just said that this is the only time that we're going to talk about race in the conference, I'm sure that's not true.
Nope.
They were just talking about race in the panel that we just finished. They didn't say it much, maybe it got mentioned twice, but they were talking about race. Any conversation that you have that is about inequality and inequity inevitably gets there. But we have had a tradition in this country of black people being very honest about themselves, about their relationship to white people, about the challenges of race as a way of making it in the world. And white people need to build that muscle.
So Why do you think that is? I mean, what kinds of things, tell us what we can do about that in particular. Why do you think that is that people are just so afraid to talk about it? It's uncomfortable.
Well, there are many reasons, and many of them are very obvious. But I do think that, let me come at this a different way, because the last panel talked a lot about hope. And when those children were killed in Texas a few months ago, I lost hope for a minute. And it never happens to me, but I really felt that hope was slipping away. And I happened to read that morning something someone sent to me, which was a quote from Miriam Kaba, the woman who you know does prison abolition work. And it was that hope is a discipline, that hope is a discipline. And it just was what I needed to hear in that moment. And part of the reason that Black people have talked about race so much is that we have been practicing the discipline of hope. We have been practicing it, trying to understand, why is life so hard for us? Despite the education that we get, despite the overtures that we make, despite the accomplishments that we have been able to secure within the community and sometimes even outside of it, and to continue to go forward, you've got to understand the history. You have to go back and look at that history. Painful as it is, it helps to provide what we need for the discipline of hope. The discipline of hope requires information. It requires accurate information. It requires historical information.
So talk about that. Talk about, you always talked about we need to know where we were to understand how we are now.
That's
and I
right.
think that's really important. Talk about
what
that.
have I learned?
So by the way, we have now permission, right, to speak about race. We have permission for everyone to get out of your comfort zone. Okay? Is that right?
Sure.
Yep.
And to answer your question, it has been so important to look into that history.
Yep.
And here's what I found out. 3 things. One is that the nation was built on genocide for the purpose of stealing land, on human bondage for the purpose of slave labor. And the prosperity that is the nation was built on these atrocities. That in order to be able to justify those atrocities, white people became engaged in a narrative and a story that justified it based on a hierarchy of human value. And that hierarchy of human value could justify what was happening, and it has stayed as part of the narrative of the nation. It is important to go into every detail of what I just pointed out. And you can go from before enslavement, you can come to after slavery, you can go to what happened in terms of retrenchment from Reconstruction, you can look at what happened with the Great Migration and what people met in the North and the West and just a little further up the coast. You can go through all of that and you will get some information, and it won't be enough. Because too often when we say we have to understand the story, the racial story, we talk about the racial story that I just told. But there are 2 other big parts to the racial story. And the other part is white people becoming white. White people didn't come here thinking themselves as white. They came as Italians, they came as Irish, they came as this, they came as that. And systematically, in relationship to this story and in this hierarchy, white people became white. This is well documented, written down, it's important to know. But that's not enough. That part of what's going on right now in terms of the threat to democracy is that there is a real angst among a lot of people who are white, that as the demographics change, that people are going to lose something. They think that they're going to lose something. They think that this country that has provided an opportunity for them to do so well, if it provides it to the people who are now becoming the majority, that they are going to suffer. Part of this is not understanding the history. They don't understand the history of how the government systematically invested in white people and built the white middle class. You got to understand that part of the story too, because without it, you can't begin to accept that the way forward is to be generous again. The nation was generous with people who were white. They were able to have land given to them. They were able, after World War II, to have education given to them. They were able, during the Highway Act, not just to have homes given to them in the suburbs, and given. When I say given, I don't mean given. I mean no interest on a loan, little interest on a loan, no down payment given to them. And then an investment in the infrastructure of the nation in terms of schools and highways and public transit and water systems to make the homes affordable to live in that would not otherwise have been. We've got to understand that story too, because if you take it all in, you end up being at a place where you say, there are people who are not doing well in this country because the odds have been stacked against them. And while all of those people are not black, many are Latinx, many are indigenous, many are Asian, many are white, many are transgender, many are people with disabilities. But what everybody has in common is their suffering is an oppression that is taking place in a nation in which in the black-white paradigm, we develop the protocols of oppression.
Okay, so very eye-opening for a number of people, particularly where I come from in Ohio, I would say. So let's, I wish we had a little more time, but let's talk about. So
I can talk twice as fast.
I know. Okay. Maybe we should try that. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, and please come up later as we do that. So we know kind of, in a sense, you gave us a flavor, a sense of where we came from and where we are now. I think what we do is the discipline of hope, right? Is where can we go? What's the destination in your mind? I think people want to hear that because that's truly remarkable.
I hope somebody will ask me about the protocols of oppression because I'd like to talk about that.
Please ask that question later. Yes.
But I do want to talk about where we go, and I want to talk about where we go within the context of democracy, because the democracy is under threat, and it is so frightening. Because we just were at a point where we were about to breathe life into democracy. Because what we really have not had is a thriving multiracial democracy. And until democracy can operate within the context of profound difference, it is not a democracy worth standing up for. And that is the opportunity that the United States of America has, is how do we in a world nation, and we clearly are a world nation, begin to demonstrate how democracy can work within the context of difference and work in a way in which it thrives. That is our job. That is our job. That is our opportunity. And even though it feels really bad right now, this is a moment full of opportunity, because what we have to do is show the nation the way forward. Show that equity and inclusion and equality, that is not a zero-sum game. That the economic fear that so many people have can be addressed. And so what we need to do is understand that while the framers of the nation were deeply flawed, when you read their biographies, it breaks your heart when you find out the disconnect between who they were as individuals and the words that they wrote down and that came out. Studying those documents has really allowed me to understand what it means to punch above your moral weight. They punched above their moral weight, way above it. And the heirs of those framers are the people now who are working for change in their communities. They are people like Nsé Ufot, who is leading the New Georgia Project, who's actually breathing profound life into the mechanism of voting, which is so important in Georgia. People like Latasha Brown doing that same kind of work. But it's also people like Eric Liu at Citizen University, who's developing on Saturdays a new way for people to come together in their communities and find a new way to talk, a new way to speak. And you know, we can't have a thriving multiracial democracy if we don't have a just economy. And Felicia Wong at the Roosevelt project has done so much to really elevate what's wrong with neoliberalism, what the economic model of market-driven policy has actually done to hold us back and to stifle us. And then people like Derek Hamilton at the New School with baby bonds and federal job guarantees and reparations and repair, all of these kinds of issues. They are just so important. And then we have to think about what it is that people are actually doing to organize in their local communities around education and health and access to water and climate change. These aren't just the people that we fund because they fall within the categories of a funding stream. These are the heirs to the framers and the founders of the nation who are breathing life into participation and voice and agency. They're creating models for a just economy in which all can participate. They're beginning to show us how we have to have a racial equity governing agenda in the departments of transportation and education and health and human services and homeland security and treasury. All of them have to be thinking about how do we use every penny that we are spending, whatever we're spending it on, to make sure that we're advancing racial equity and inclusion. Because we have gotten to a point in which the fate of the nation is dependent on the very people who have been systematically left behind. And that is the most important issue that every policy and resource has to work on. So I don't think that we are at a loss at all for what to do. We're doing it. We're not funding it big enough. We're not being creative enough. We're not self-conscious enough. And we aren't lifting up a new narrative. I grew up as a black girl in St. Louis, Missouri in the 1950s and the early 60s, believing all the hype. Even as my parents were struggling as black people to be able to reach their full potential and convince us that we could reach our full potential, I bought into the story of a nation that was built on the issues of justice and equality. Also grew up on the idea that through struggle, things would get better, that the nation wanted to live into its ideals. That was largely myth. And just as I grew out of my naivete, so has the nation. There are a lot of people who have decided that we can't really have a nation that can work for all. And people are digging down, digging in, and saying we have to look out for our group. Some people have come to that same conclusion and just assume there's no place for them here. And we see the results of that hopelessness in the streets and cities all across America. But there is a new story to tell, but that story has to be based on a true history. That story has to accept the angst of those who are afraid and show that equity is not a zero-sum game. And any good story needs heroes, and boy, have we got a lot of them.
So I love, you just made my question so much easier, okay? Narrative, story. You talked about, you got the elements of what that is. You've got to give a truthful explanation how we got here. Invest in people, zero sum. There's the solidarity thing that you've written about, okay? I want to go into the narrative piece because, a lot of people here are working on democracy. They're working on alternatives to democracy. But one of the things that I've learned is you can tell people what they need to know and they're not going to use it at all, right? They are, and so I want to ask you about what that story is, and I can talk to them blue in my face about what I think needs to be done and why it's important. I think there's a dearth of funding, so to speak, on the narrative itself. What is the story? Because, as you said before, and we talked about this, what needs to be said versus what can be heard is a huge gap. And the only way you can bridge that, I believe, okay, is by a story that appeals to everybody. So what does that look like? It has to have the elements that you talked about, but what is the narrative? And I'm not saying that you have the answer, but I think that's something that we should all be thinking about. What is that new narrative that we're going to have to use when we come up with a solution as to where we need to go or what are the elements we get there?
Well, I thank you for the question, and it is something that we all need to be struggling with. And it is finding that road. I've just told you what needs to be said. But the question is, how can it be heard? How can it be heard? The first thing that many people conclude is nobody can hear anything that talks about race, that the only people who will hear it are people who are already there. We've got to work through that because we cannot tell a story about race if we cannot talk about race. So don't assume that the way to tell the story that I just said is to remove the racial aspect, call it something else, and then move on. If you call it something else, people will never come back to the race. And I've been in that a zillion times where people say, I get it, we're just not going to talk about race. And then what comes back is something that doesn't have anything to do with race, that's not informed by race, that's not tethered to the real struggle, and it doesn't make a difference. So the story must bring race in, and we collectively are smart enough to figure out how to do that. The story that I tell about race is, I grew up as a black girl in St. Louis, Missouri, and it's the best thing that ever happened to me. The seriousness of growing up as a black girl. I've met people who wonder what their purpose is in life. I have never once awakened and asked myself that question. I came here with purpose, and it is energizing, and it's exciting, and it focuses you. We have people in our midst who have made a life of struggling for freedom. You want to work hand in hand with people who know freedom because they know what it means not to have it. Danielle Allen at Harvard talks about this in ways that are just exquisite. The story has to bring race in. The story cannot just throw away white people who are afraid and call them names and act as if they are just rats. We have to understand that they are people, that they have an anxiety, and it is anxiety that needs to be addressed. They don't see a future in which there is not white supremacy. The white supremacy future is not a future at all. That is dead. There is a future, and your future will be bright in it. We got to figure out a way to tell that. We got to show it. We got to show it with numbers. We got to show it with anecdote. We got to show it with relationships. We got to show it with trust. And then we really do have to invest in the young people who come with a different sensibility, a different sense of what is possible. And we need to talk about them, not just fund them, but talk about them. Call their names, call their movements. Saru Jayaraman, she is the leader of One Fair Wage, and One Fair Wage is transforming the nation in terms of what we think of in terms of how much money people should make if they work. Call her name, call her movement, lift these people up so that people can know that the people who are going to take us to this place that I'm trying to describe are amongst us. They are working hard, and they are full of hope.
Okay, thank you. So really quickly, I'm going to ask two more questions. I think it's important for people to hear the idea of your concept, transactional versus transformative solidarity. Mm-hmm. I think that's really, that's a really important concept for people to be thinking about now.
It's what it is so important to practice, transformative solidarity, that we have gotten real comfortable with transactional solidarity. You sign my petition, I will sign yours. You show up for my march, and I'll help you get your op-ed in the LA Times. You work on my issue, and I promise I'll work on yours when that comes. That's transactional solidarity. That'll take you a little ways. But what we need to realize is that your issue is my issue. And I need to understand that I am not making progress if you are not making progress. That people who are with disabilities understand that so much of what they are able to do through their struggle has extraordinary benefit for everybody. That when we work on issues from a black perspective, a lot of people talk about addressing anti-blackness directly. They talk about centering blackness in the struggle. That does not mean to ask someone to put their struggle on a back burner. It means understand with depth that whatever your struggle is, it is embedded in anti-blackness and the oppression that comes out of that, so that we work together because we are solving our collective problems. When we feel it that way, when we understand that climate change hits people who are of color and poor first and worst. And therefore, in California, whenever anything goes on the ballot that has anything to do with climate, people of color overwhelmingly vote for it. They get that. They understand that the environmental justice issues are at the core of the racial issues. And so transactional solidarity says, let's have a big story about what has to change for us to achieve the state of full inclusion, of equity, of fairness, and justice, and work on those issues as if your life depends on it, because it does.
Okay, we've unfortunately run out of time. Now, I know we have rearranged this conference to have a lot of in-between sessions that you can actually talk with people. Angela will be here. So 30 seconds, okay? What are the two things, or if anyone, I mean, there's going to be a lot of stuff people are going to listen, but what are the two big points you want people to remember from being with you here?
I hope that people will remember that the racial angst that is here is a source of strength for our leadership at home and throughout the world. Don't run away from it. To the degree that we can start to really make progress on race here, we become strong and we have something to offer. Because the kind of struggles that are happening around the world are also embedded in that kind of angst. Embrace the racial struggles. There is so much benefit that will come from it. The next thing I think that I would hope people would learn is not anything that I talked about, but something that the other panel talked about so much, and that is, how do we begin to get at the failure of our institutions around social media, around narrative, around culture, that we've got to not just try to solve these problems within the 501c3 context. We have to solve it in the culture too. Make that a priority and take your best selves into that struggle.
Okay, Angela Glover Blackwell, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for your perspective.
Thank you.
Let me just say, it has been a true joy to have met you, to spend time with you before this conference, and to spend time with you here. And I think the voice is going to come on, right?
And say what?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.